March 1943. The thaw had begun on the Eastern Front, turning the once frozen ground into a sea of mud. The Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, had arrived, and with it came a strange phenomenon that would perplex German commanders and intelligence officers for the remainder of the war. Soviet T-34 tanks were advancing in areas where German reconnaissance had confirmed fuel shortages. Engines that should have fallen silent continued to roar across the steppe. Soviet armor pushed forward when all intelligence indicated they should have been immobilized. For the Wehrmacht, it was as if they were fighting against ghosts, mechanical specters that defied the fundamental rules of warfare and logistics. This is the story of Soviet ingenuity born of desperation, of battlefield adaptation that left the methodical German war machine bewildered, and of how necessity became the mother of an invention so unconventional that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe their own field reports. The winter of 1942-43 had been brutal, even by Russian standards. Following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back along vast stretches of the Eastern Front. But winter was Russia's ally, and with the coming of spring, the strategic advantage would shift. Or so the German High Command believed. What they failed to anticipate was the Soviet capacity for improvisation, an essential quality born from years of hardship and scarcity. Major Dmitry Volkov of the 5th Guards Tank Army stood in ankle-deep mud, watching as technicians worked feverishly on the engine compartment of a T-34 medium tank. The smell of alcohol was unmistakable, mixing with the omnipresent odors of mud, exhaust fumes, and the lingering metallic scent of spent shell casings that permeated every battlefield. "How much longer?" Volkov asked, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The tank's commander, Senior Lieutenant Petrov, emerged from the engine compartment, wiping his hands on a filthy rag. "We're almost ready, Comrade Major. The modified injectors are installed. We've adjusted the fuel delivery system as best we could." Volkov nodded, eyeing the line of tanks behind them. 24 T-34s, their crews waiting with a mixture of skepticism and hope. These were the vanguard of an experimental combat group, and upon their success or failure rested the outcome of the upcoming offensive. 200 kilometers to the west, Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann of the Wehrmacht's intelligence section pored over reconnaissance reports with growing frustration. Something didn't add up. According to their intelligence, the Soviet fuel dumps in this sector had been successfully bombed 3 days prior. The railway lines that could have brought fuel tankers forward had been cut by Luftwaffe attack. By all accounts, the Soviet armor in this sector should have been immobilized, or at the very least, severely restricted in their operations. Yet reconnaissance flights continued to report columns of T-34s moving toward the front. "It's impossible," Hoffmann muttered, tossing the report onto his desk. Major Weber, his superior, looked up with tired eyes. "The Russians are moving fuel forward somehow. Find out how." Hoffmann shook his head. "We've had the roads under surveillance, no fuel trucks, no rail movements, nothing that could explain this." Weber's expression hardened. "Then they've devised some new method of supply. Find it, Hoffmann. The Führer expects us to hold this sector, and we cannot do so if we don't understand what we're facing." Back at the Soviet position, the first modified T-34 roared to life, black smoke belching from its exhaust pipes. The engine note was different, rougher, less consistent, but it was running. Petrov climbed into the commander's cupola, giving Volkov a thumbs up through the open hatch. The major returned the gesture, though his face remained impassive. He had seen too many promising innovations fail under combat conditions to celebrate prematurely. The tank lurched forward, churning through the mud with characteristic T-34 agility. Behind it, the crews of the other tanks watched intently. This was more than a technical experiment. It was a glimpse of hope in the face of chronic supply shortages that plagued the Red Army, despite the increasing industrial output of factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. The tanks began to move out, one by one, their engines running on a substance that no German tanker would ever have considered a viable fuel source: vodka, grain alcohol, and a mixture of captured German antifreeze. The unlikely cocktail was the brainchild of a Soviet engineer named Mikhail Koshkin, who had reasoned that the high alcohol content might serve as an emergency substitute for conventional fuel. It wasn't ideal. The engines ran hotter, power output was reduced, and the long-term effects on the engine components were concerning. But it allowed mobility when there should have been none. 3 days later, Oberleutnant Hoffmann stood in stunned silence before the burning wreckage of a German defensive position. The attack had come at dawn, spearheaded by T-34s, that German intelligence had insisted could not be operational due to fuel shortages. The Soviet tanks had smashed through the German lines, creating a breach that infantry units quickly exploited. Now, as Hoffmann surveyed the destruction, he struggled to comprehend how his assessment could have been so wrong. A German panzer crewman approached, his face blackened with soot and oil. "They came out of nowhere, Herr Oberleutnant. We weren't expecting armor. Intelligence said they had no fuel." Hoffmann's jaw tightened. Clearly they found some. The panzer crewman hesitated. "There's something else, sir. One of the T-34s was disabled by our fire. When it burst into flames, the fire was strange. Blue flames like alcohol burning, and the smell." Hoffmann's attention sharpened. "What smell?" "Like spirits, sir. Strong alcohol. Some of the men joked that the Russians must have been transporting their vodka rations in the fuel tanks." But Hoffmann wasn't laughing. A terrible suspicion was beginning to form in his mind. In Moscow, at a hastily convened meeting of the State Defense Committee, the reports of the experimental tank unit's success were being received with cautious optimism. General Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander, listened intently as a technical officer explained the modifications that had allowed the T-34s to operate on alternative fuel. "The conversion is not without problems, Comrade General," the officer concluded. "Engine wear is accelerated. Efficiency is reduced by approximately 30%. And of course, there is the question of supply. Alcohol production would need to be significantly diverted from other uses." Stalin, who had been silent throughout the presentation, suddenly spoke. "The German invaders burn our crops, destroy our fuel depots, and believe that by doing so, they will immobilize our forces." He paused to light his pipe. "They do not understand the Russian soul. We will convert our distilleries to produce fuel for our tanks if necessary. We will use every resource at our disposal to drive them from our soil." No one in the room mentioned that many distilleries had already been unofficially diverting a portion of their production to the front, not as fuel for tanks, but as liquid courage for the men who crewed them. Now that same substance would power the machines of war themselves in a symbolic convergence that seemed almost poetic. On the front lines, the modified T-34s of Senior Lieutenant Petrov's company advanced through the pre-dawn mist. The air was cold, and the ground remained partially frozen, providing better traction than the mud that would return with the warmth of day. Petrov stood in his commander's cupola, scanning the terrain ahead through binoculars. Behind him, the loader was complaining about the smell of alcohol that permeated the tank's interior. "Be grateful, Dmitri," the gunner quipped. "At least we'll die smelling like we've been to a good party." The men laughed, tension momentarily broken. For tank crews, humor was a shield against the constant awareness of their vulnerability. The T-34, for all its revolutionary design, was still a steel coffin when hit by an armor-piercing round. The radio crackled. Forward observers had spotted a German defensive position. Petrov relayed the coordinates to his gunner. The tank's turret swiveled, the 76mm gun seeking its target. Petrov gave the order to fire, and the cannon roared. The shell found its mark, exploding among a group of German anti-tank guns. The attack had begun. Oberleutnant Hoffmann's report to Berlin concerning the Soviet use of alcohol as tank fuel was met with disbelief. "Preposterous," declared Colonel Müller of the Wehrmacht's technical division. "No modern tank engine could function effectively on such a fuel source. The damage to internal components alone would render the vehicles inoperable within hours." Hoffmann stood his ground. "With respect, Herr Oberst, we have recovered samples from disabled Soviet tanks. The chemical analysis is conclusive. They are using some form of high-proof alcohol, likely supplemented with other substances." Müller's expression remained skeptical. "Even if this improvisation now were technically possible, it would be a desperate measure of limited tactical value. Certainly not something that warrants revising our strategic assessments." But Hoffmann had seen the results firsthand. "Respectfully, sir, this desperate measure has already resulted in the breakthrough of our lines in 3 sectors. The Russians have turned a logistical liability into an operational advantage. They're advancing when our intelligence said they should be stationary." As spring progressed into early summer, the improvised fuel system was refined and standardized across growing numbers of Soviet armored units. Distilleries across unoccupied Soviet territory were partially converted to produce the specialized alcohol blend, which technicians had improved by adding captured German synthetic oil components when available. The result was still inferior to conventional diesel fuel, but it had become a reliable alternative that confounded German expectations. For the Red Army, it was one more example of the resourcefulness that had become their hallmark, the same spirit that had seen factories dismantled and rebuilt beyond the Urals. that had put women into shipyards and children into munitions factories. Major Volkov, now promoted to lieutenant colonel for his role in implementing the alternative fuel program, stood before a map showing the latest front lines. The German retreat continued, not a rout, but a steady withdrawal in the face of pressure they had not anticipated being able to apply. A staff officer approached with a new intelligence report. German communications indicate they're reinforcing their fuel depots with additional air defenses, the officer reported. They've realized that our ability to use alternative fuels doesn't mean we wouldn't prefer conventional diesel. Volkov nodded. They're learning, but too slowly. Across the lines, the German High Command had finally accepted the reality of the Soviet fuel innovation, though many technical experts continued to express skepticism about its long-term viability. The psychological impact, however, was undeniable. The Soviets had once again demonstrated an ability to overcome what should have been crippling shortages through improvisation and determination. For German troops, it reinforced the growing sense that they faced an enemy who could not be defeated by conventional means, an enemy who, when deprived of essential supplies, simply found alternatives that German military doctrine didn't account for. In a bunker near the front, Oberleutnant Hoffmann, recently promoted to Hauptmann, briefed a group of intelligence officers. We must assume that conventional interdiction of fuel supplies will have limited effect on Soviet armored capabilities, he explained. Their ability to utilize alternative fuel sources, while not without technical drawbacks, provides them with operational flexibility that our current intelligence assessments have failed to properly account for. In July 1943, as both sides prepared for what would become the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, the impact of the Soviet fuel innovation was apparent in German planning. Luftwaffe raids on Soviet supply lines continued, but fuel depots were no longer considered priority targets. The Germans had been forced to adapt their strategy to account for an enemy who had fundamentally changed the equations of mechanized warfare. For the Soviets, the alcohol fuel remained an emergency alternative rather than a preferred option. When conventional diesel was available, they used it. But the knowledge that their tanks could continue to operate even when cut off from traditional supply lines provided both practical and psychological advantages. In the villages and towns behind the front lines, distilleries that had once produced vodka for celebrations now worked around the clock to ensure that the machines of war would not fall silent. The morning of July 12, 1943, dawned hot and clear near the village of Prokhorovka. This day would see the largest concentration of armored vehicles ever to clash on a single battlefield. As the massive Soviet and German tank formations closed with each other, sending up vast clouds of dust that could be seen for miles, the distinctive smell of alcohol exhaust mingled with the acrid odor of cordite and burning metal. German Tiger tanks, technical marvels with their 80mm guns and thick armor, found themselves fighting not just against the more numerous T-34s, but against Soviet resourcefulness itself. When a German shell found its mark on a T-34 running on alcohol fuel, the resulting fire burned with a characteristic blue flame, visible even through the dust and smoke of battle. For the German tankers, it became a grim reminder that they faced an enemy who refused to be bound by the conventional rules of warfare and logistics. By the end of the day, hundreds of tanks from both sides lay burning on the battlefield. The Soviet counteroffensive at Kursk would ultimately succeed, not because of any single technological advantage, but because of countless adaptations and improvisations, the alternative fuel being just one, that collectively allowed the Red Army to overcome their limitations. In the aftermath of Kursk, as the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front shifted decisively to the Soviets, the story of the tanks that ran without conventional fuel became part of the growing legend of Soviet perseverance. For the German forces, it was one more piece of evidence that they were fighting not just against the Red Army's growing numerical and material superiority, but against a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one characterized by pragmatic solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. In Berlin, military planners who had once dismissed reports of alcohol-fueled tanks as fantasy now scrambled to identify other potential Soviet improvisations that might affect the strategic balance. But they were perpetually one step behind, trying to anticipate the next innovation from an enemy who had elevated necessity-driven invention to a form of military doctrine. The war would rage on for almost 2 more years, with the Soviet forces pushing inexorably westward. The alternative fuel systems would be used less frequently as Soviet supply lines shortened and access to conventional diesel improved. But but the psychological impact remained. German forces never again made the mistake of assuming that logistical interdiction alone could halt a Soviet armored advance. For the Soviet tank crews who had participated in the early trials of the system, there was a particular pride in having turned the very substance of traditional Russian culture, the grain alcohol that had warmed generations through bitter winters, into a weapon of war against an invader who had sought to destroy that culture. It was a perfect symmetry. The drink that had long been said to embody the Russian spirit now literally powered the machines that were driving the invaders from Russian soil. As the Soviet armies pressed into Eastern Europe and ultimately into Germany itself, the legend grew. German civilians, huddling in cellars as T-34s rumbled through their streets, whispered about Russian tanks that ran on vodka, a claim that was technically inaccurate, but captured an essential truth about the Soviet capacity for improvisation. For the Red Army, it became a point of pride. One more example of how they had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through collectivist ingenuity and determination. Stalin himself would later cite the alternative fuel program as evidence of Soviet technological creativity, conveniently overlooking the fact that it had been born of desperate necessity rather than planned innovation. In the end, the alcohol-fueled tanks of the Eastern Front became more than just a technical curiosity or a temporary solution to a logistical problem. They became a symbol of the fundamental clash of approaches that characterized the Eastern Front: German methodical planning versus Soviet adaptability, German technical sophistication versus Soviet practical improvisation. Today, more than 7 decades after the conclusion of the Great Patriotic War, the story of the Soviet tanks that ran without conventional fuel remains a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. In military academies around the world, it is studied as a classic example of how battlefield adaptation can overcome logistical limitations and confound enemy expectations. For modern Russia, it stands as part of a proud heritage of technological improvisation under pressure, a quality that continues to influence Russian military doctrine to this day. And for the dwindling number of veterans who experienced it firsthand, the mechanics who retrofitted the engines, the distillery workers who produced the alternative fuel, and the tank crews who drove into battle with the distinctive smell of alcohol exhaust trailing behind them, it remains a personal memory of a time when the impossible became possible through sheer determination and refusal to accept defeat. In the great tapestry of the Eastern Front, where millions died and the course of world history was forever altered, the story of the tanks that ran on alcohol might seem like a minor thread, but it captures something essential about why the Soviet Union ultimately prevailed against an enemy that by all conventional military assessments should have been victorious. It is a reminder that in warfare, as in life, the human capacity for adaptation and improvisation can sometimes overcome even the most daunting material disadvantages, and it stands as a warning to military planners everywhere. Never assume that cutting off conventional supplies will immobilize an enemy determined enough to find unconventional alternatives. The next time you raise a glass of vodka, perhaps spare a thought for the T-34 tanks of the Eastern Front, whose engines once roared with that same fiery spirit. In the darkest days of the war, when conventional fuel was scarce and the need for mobility was paramount, it was this quintessentially Russian product that helped keep the tanks moving and the hope of victory alive. From the distilleries of the Soviet heartland to the battlefields of Kursk and beyond, alcohol, the traditional balm for Russian suffering, became an unlikely weapon in the arsenal of a people fighting for their very survival. The Germans couldn't explain it because they approached warfare with a different mindset. They failed to understand that for a nation fighting a war of survival on its own soil, the conventional rules and limitations of military logistics could be overcome through sheer will and creativity. The tanks that ran without conventional fuel were more than just a technical innovation. They were the embodiment of a people's refusal to be conquered, a metallic manifestation of the Russian soul that has withstood invaders for centuries. And in that sense, perhaps it was fitting that they were powered by the very substance that Russians have traditionally used to celebrate their greatest victories and mourn their most devastating defeats. The story reminds us that in the most terrible of human endeavors, warfare, it is sometimes not superior technology or numbers that decide the outcome, but the intangible qualities of determination, adaptability, and the simple refusal to accept defeat. These are the lessons of the Eastern Front. written in steel and fire, and powered by the unexpected marriage of Russia's oldest cultural tradition with the mechanized warfare of the modern age.